So, to think about Bloodchild this week, I wanted to have us think about subject position in writing and the idea of woman, and I'm very deliberately using quotation marks here, and the way one in the West, one in the West traditionally, who has controlled narratives of all kinds, and two, what those narratives have done in the depiction of woman as a concept and femininity as a concept, and how woman as a concept gets used in literature. And from woman, and I'm making this series of progressions because it's sort of the progression that was made in critical literature about thinking through these ideas, thinking about race, and thinking about animality as it's depicted in literature. So if we think about the whole history of the West and its narratives, and when I say narratives, I don't just mean in terms of literature, but I mean scientific narratives, philosophical narratives. When we get into more recent history, we have, and I should say also theological narratives about women. When we get into more recent history, we have, with the onset of Enlightenment thinking, whole new theories about the body, the mind, and this takes us up through Freud, etc. Whole ways of understanding the world that until really the 20th century, all of these ways of understanding the world were very totalizing, right? The idea of an explanatory system, and many were proposed and many were developed and elaborated upon, but the idea of an explanatory system that had total explanatory power for everything on Earth, right? So going clear back in history, we start out with religions, whose theological systems and faith systems theoretically take in all of human life, all of life on Earth, right? How to live, total explanations for how things began, how things are working, how things will go in the future, right? And as those older religious narratives break down in the West, we get introduced to philosophical narratives from all sides, right? And you can just, starting in Greece, right? Plato and Aristotle, going up through, Descartes and Kant and, Hegel and, right, all of these names, to scientific ways of thinking, to political ways of thinking, to clear up through things like Freud, right? Psychoanalytic ways of thinking and ways of understanding the human mind. And all of these things have been supposed analyses and explanations of the world and how it works in totality, right? And it's really not until the 20th century that you get people questioning the idea that it's possible to represent the entire world in a single construction of thinking. And I bring all of this up because in the West, every single one of these propositions, going back in time until very, very recently, were the developments of men. Mostly white. And this is important for thinking about what those narratives had to say about, let's start with, women, right? Because women were not able, in these narrative stories, and I said not just story, all kinds of lines of thinking, all kinds of systems of thinking, women were not able to speak for themselves, right? It is not women constructing the narrative. And so rather we get men's description of woman and womanhood and femininity. And traditionally, and you can probably think about this, you may have encountered similar things in other classes, to be quite honest. Throughout, let us say the, early, let's go with the early modern world, right, which of course draws on older theological narratives, but the early modern world in Europe and then eventually in America. Woman is seen as the other, right? Men are people and women are women. And they're seen as the other from the subject position of men. And there's things about women that are mysterious and anxiety-inducing to these men, right? One, the idea that women, by giving birth, create life. And there's a whole line of science fiction that we could have pursued this term, and sometimes I do. It just sort of depends what mood I'm in. And honestly, this term, how well I thought it would all translate to the online environment. But thinking about the number of stories, going back to that very first text in science fiction, Frankenstein, right? The number of stories that are about men trying to usurp from women this last domain of power that they seem to exclusively have. The creation of life. Frankenstein, Preobrazhensky is part of this line. If you've ever seen the film Metropolis, right. So there's a whole line of science fiction that kind of deals with this attempt of male scientists to usurp the life-creating powers of women. And I want to stop here and say that I am not insensitive to the fact that in our contemporary understanding of gender, it's a spectrum. There are men who can get pregnant. There are women who cannot. And so I'm not trying to be essentialist myself, but as a shorthand while I talk about this, I think we can all recognize that, these male subjects in the past constructing these narratives did identify woman as a biological agent, right? With child birthing capacities, right? I mean, this is part of the sort of anatomical understanding of woman besides just the conceptual understanding of woman. So I don't want to perpetuate that kind of essentializing, but clearly we're going to talk about it as the sort of prevailing point of view. So all these philosophers, all these thinkers, etc., they're confronting woman, and woman is mysterious and anxiety-inducing. Mysterious and powerful for her ability to create life, and therefore regarded as closer to nature, right? So if, particularly after a period of, the beginnings of the Enlightenment, if we're thinking back into the 1500s and the 1600s, men, masculinity is seen as being associated with rationalizing the world, with civilization, with capital P progress, with gaining control over nature, not coincidentally. And whereas women are seen as more atavistic, they're not progressive. They are in fact tied to some deeper, more ancient sort of instincts, animals, right? And so women are seen as not being in control of themselves, which gives justification to all kinds of societal structures where, women go from the care of their fathers to the care of their husbands to the care of their sons throughout their lifetime because they can't really care for themselves. And this is seen as because women are irrational and women are too emotional and women are too primitive and women supposedly need their sexual urges controlled. Women are seen as mercurial in general. Women are seen as not as intelligent as men because they are not as capable of rationalistic thinking because of their closeness to nature. I mean, some of this goes clear back to, the story of Eve, right? But these things linger on through Western civilization. And my point is, and I'm sure you've encountered some evidence of this, like I said, lines of thinking about this in other classes, or just you've discovered it on your own. And what's important for us to think about is that this conception of women is one developed by men, right? Because it is men who control these narratives and who actually make them. Men are in this subject position, and to them women are this other, and onto this other they project all of these assumptions that do justify unfair, inequitable power hierarchies, that do justify the keeping of women as a kind of property, in many cases in the early modern world, that do justify subjugating women to roles of just perpetuating men's genealogical lines and things like that, right? I mean, this, and which comes first, the chicken or the egg, is sort of not even important. It's a cyclical nature, right? And of course, as we know, in the 20th century, feminism pushes back on this, right? Feminism, both as a political movement, but also feminist studies in academia, right? So you have scholars, women scholars and theorists, who begin to pick apart and critique and diagnose and describe and present alternatives to these long-standing understandings. And then a political movement that acts on those ideas to try to gain equity in the real world, right? We're all familiar with that. So my point is that when we then think about woman, not women, not like I'm a woman, but in literature, in narratives of all kinds, there is, and the term for this, there's a term for it. Alice Jardine does a lot of the heavy lifting. If you want to look up her book Gynesis, of course, is just a cringe word, right? What a terrible word. But Alice Jardine is an English-speaking writer who consolidated a lot of theory and work done by French feminists, and I mentioned Luce Irigaray in a previous lecture, into a really cogent and much more comprehensible, for average people, sort of way of thinking about women's subjectivity. So I'm drawing on her work, so you can look up Alice Jardine and so forth, and dodge those French feminist theorists who are like Julia Kristeva, very difficult to read. And I said gynesis is a terrible word, but it describes this phenomenon where within a narrative, and this can be a literary narrative or this can be an explanatory narrative. So Jardine does, and because the French ladies were talking about it, psychoanalysis as a kind of explanatory tool, because remember it's the 60s, and so that's where we all are at the time in academia, thinking about Freud and Lacan and all that. But as an explanatory tool for the human psyche, that within these explanatory narratives, as well as in literary narratives, woman becomes this gap, this space, where there aren't actually women, like characters or people in the story. There is a blank space into which we project. The author projects, right? So Freud is the author of the explanatory narrative, projects meanings and metaphors. Or we, the reader, right? The author of a piece of literature, or us as readers, project into this blank space marked woman all sorts of, symbols and ideas, all of this kind of background, that we've got stewing in our heads from growing up in Western culture, right? We project all of this, and woman therefore just slips right into being metaphor, occupying this metaphorical space where there's no actual women represented anywhere. And, until women themselves get the chance to do some writing. There's just all of this empty space for metaphor and symbol and projection, which is not the same thing, right? Kind of constructions of what femininity is and what it means, to the point where, Jardine, or at least Ray Helford is a more modern feminist sort of women's studies writers talked about this, to the point where even when women write about women, it's basically impossible to get away from this tradition, right? We're not that far out from it, right? 100 years of women writing in any, sort of culturally really important or affecting way, right? We're not that far away from this. And so woman is always still, though, hopefully in the future not, a problematic object in a text, right? And so there's this very different thing between being a subject and being an object and being a problematic object at that. And problematic because there's such an ill-defined quality to it, other than this just massive series of available projections and metaphors and slipping, and again, just slipping. The meaning is not clear. And so you can see that this line of thinking in feminist, sort of literary theory and philosophy also owes quite a bit to postmodernism per se, the idea that meanings are not and perhaps cannot be concrete. So, you have Freud perhaps saying that, in psychoanalysis, this is woman. And again, there's that problem of the subject position, and so, you have a non-woman describing what woman is, and with all this sort of burdensome, but he's declaring a clear, like, this is woman. And then you have women theorists who come along and are like, well, no, one, no. But two, even when you say this is woman, what you're actually saying is this is a million things. And in Freud's case, it was sort of easy to point out because of all the ways in which she's using women to symbolize, if you do dream analysis, how women are being symbolized and blah, 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 right? The problematic object, the problematic other, right? And this has to do with the fact that women had been foreclosed for so long from constructing their own narratives. And so whenever you have, someone else defining you, someone who is not like you and does not occupy your positions in the world, this is going to lead to problems. And when this happens for millennia, all of this now just comes backloaded, which is, so you have a text that's like got woman in it, and there's standing behind this the weight of 5,000 years or something. Right, with all of the sort of metaphors and symbols and projections and bad ideas about womanhood and femininity and et cetera, and that makes women problematic objects in texts. I think you can see how this becomes true also as it relates in the West to race, right? To white authors commanding the narrative surrounding the racial other, right? And so we can see plenty of examples of the ways in which not just, say, African people or people of African American descent, or Asian people of Asian descent, we already touched on it, Orientalism, right? Think back to Orientalism, and it, as we discussed it back in Module 2, a very similar idea to this, right? The idea that you have non-Asian peoples constructing this concept of the Orient and what Oriental people are like and what it all means. And so, we discussed that in terms of, racist stereotypes and how those kinds of tropes get put to use. And this is an example of this, the idea that we do not have Asian characters, someone who just is, right? We have the Orient, right? Which also just slips in its meaning, as we saw between, say, the Orientalism of Western Europe during the colonial era versus the Orientalism in America as it relates to Japan. Very, very different, right? America projecting this anxiety about its inferiority compared to the Japanese versus, Britain in the 19th century declaring that, Egypt's can't rule itself. Egyptians are incapable of such things, right? Very, very different in the details. But if we take a step back, the broader idea that here the Asian is not a subject from the point of view of, the white guy controlling the narrative, William Gibson or, all the dudes in British Parliament. It's this problematic object that can be filled with symbolic and metaphorical meaning, but doesn't stand on its own, right? And I don't want this to sound as though it's literally impossible for a male author to write honestly and convincingly and sensitively about women, or white authors to write honestly and convincingly and sympathetically about non-white characters, but that this is a recent phenomenon, people even attempting to do so, right? And so again, the weight of all of this for so many years is still with us when we consider the depictions of women and the racial other as it relates to white narratives in literature. And this is what Butler is getting at, right? Butler is a black woman, right? And so she writes Bloodchild in mind to the fact that woman is this traditionally slippery space filled up with all kinds of meaning, but never actually a woman. And even that the racial other, as it's traditionally depicted in Western literature, is again slippery, 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 filled up with all kinds of metaphor and symbol and projection, but not actually there in a concrete way. And someone like Elise Ray Helford, building off, what's her name, Milgary, thinking about animals in texts, which of course we brought up in relation to Heart of a Dog, right? That animals in texts also kind of face this problem, right? Animals, of course, still do not have the opportunity to control narratives about themselves. God bless, right? I mean, insofar as in the West, women and non-white peoples can now, have had the opportunity and are still building the opportunities to write controlling narratives, right? Instead of being the objects of narratives, being the subject authors of narratives, right? So this is a phenomenon. Animals still don't get this, right? And it's difficult to see at the moment how they could, although again, I think you can have a number of good faith actors, human actors, trying to fill that role, but nevertheless, right, just facts being what they are at the moment, animals remain objects in texts that they are not the subject authors of. And one might say that that's okay because, non-human animals aren't humans. They don't have narrative capacities. I don't know that that's true. But I do know that regardless of whether or not that is true, there's negative fallout for animals, right? If they always end up as the repositories of the projections of people if they too are always blank spaces in narratives, both literary and explanatory. Consider the cultural terror of the wolf, which doesn't do anything to hurt humans, right? And yet we exterminate them. There's still a fight in this country to exterminate wolves. Consider people's fear of genuinely useful animals like spiders. Snakes, right? Yeah, there's a couple poisonous snakes out there. They're not going to bite you unless they bother you, and they do good pest control, right? Or even things that we consider pests. The idea that, rats aren't out to spread the plague, right? It's not an intentional thing. This very real harm that comes to animals when they have no opportunity to occupy the subject position of a narrative, when they are reduced to objects that in the narrative become these blank spaces, these sites of projections and symbolism and metaphor, but never just themselves, right? And so there's negative consequences to animals. Even if, in the same way that there's negative, Helford points this out, even if there's negative consequences for women, and there's negative consequences for people of color to be in this position, and there's negative consequences for animals to be in this position too, which is not to say that we need to value or sort of mutually agree, or we can or we can't. Not, which is not to say that we have to agree mutually on the hierarchical valuation of women and people of color and non-human animals, but just to say that the effect is the same. And so this fact about Western narratives is being played with by Butler, right? In Bloodchild. We have, obviously, and we're going to talk about this in the Zoom call, obviously all kinds of gender mishmash going on. Tugatoy is technically female, occupies a masculine role in society, occupies a mother caretaker role with Gan, occupies a lover position with Gan, occupies the masculine role in the actual sexual act. There's all, like, it's all, Gan is technically male, but again occupies a traditionally female space, both in his relationship to Katoy and in his and in their actual sex act. Gender's all over the place in this story, which is great. It's one of the reasons I like it so much. And I want to be thinking about that. And part of this is this sort of playing around with how slippery the concept of woman is. And I like the fact that Butler turns around and makes the position of male slippery too, right? Same thing with reading race into the story. Butler gleefully calls the story her pregnant man story. So that's where her mind chiefly was. She rejects the idea as an author, she did when she was alive. She rejected the idea that this story was about slavery. Fair enough. She thought it was a more complex thing than that. But I do think that it's very possible to read out of this ideas about the construction of power hierarchies that have traditionally in the real world been defined by race and ethnicity, right? And so the kind of picking apart of the relationship between the people in power and the disempowered person, and negotiations between them to the extent possible about agency and choice and control. And one of Butler's famous sort of standalone novels is Kindred, which is a time travel tale about a contemporary African-American woman who's going back and forth in time to the antebellum South and discovers her mixed race ancestry, right? And she has to save a white kid to save her own family line. And, so this novel is interrogating the idea of race and how that idea is constructed, and how actually interwoven races that have been officially deemed separate in America actually are in their histories, and what those kinds of relationships, those real relationships, mean. That's a book I have not assigned us to read. But my point being that this question about what race might be, who defines it, and how power affects it is present in the story too, right? In a way that I think we can see real world situations encoded into the relations between Tlick and human in the story, that then allow us to sort of think in give ourselves a little more space to think about the constructions of categories, not just of gender but of race. And then the same then becomes true about animals. Tagatoy is a non-human animal, and the way she's described is she's sort of like an insect, but she's sort of like a snake, but she's a lot like a person in terms of cognition, obviously. She's soft and she's segmented, and it's really, there's something abject about her body, and yet Gan is drawn to it, right? And so Tugatoi, as an animal, as a non-human animal, is now occupying that animal space, and we can maybe start to think about ways to link this to the position of Sherrick, right? Like, what's similar in these texts between the way Sherrick gets treated and described and the way Tugatoi gets treated and described as non-human but thinking animals in these narratives, right? So there's also this that is happening. And then as a further point, I think there's a queer reading to be found very much in the story. If we think about queer studies positing the idea of, until very recently, right, the idea that within literature, queer desire has to be encoded, right? Because there's a very niche and for a long time even illegal market in things that are, outright queer. I think we see a good encoding of queer desire. I mean, again, I was just describing Tugatoi as this sort of abject, slightly abominable thing. And nevertheless, Gan is really drawn to her. Not just emotionally. The story depicts him as being sort of physically compelled by her body, which he finds comforting and elegant, and we're told he loved to watch her move. And so there is a way in which his desire for her is not merely emotional, right? He's grown up thinking of her as a caretaker, but now he's also thinking of her as a lover, frankly. He's in a deeply intimate relationship with her, and there's something that's physically compelling about her to him. Now, my point is not to say that queer desire is abject or is abominable, because it's not. But in a society that traditionally describes queer desire in those ways, it then becomes a radical depiction of queer desire, right? To depict it in ways that are subtle and nuanced. And we can go further. I don't know if anybody amongst you is familiar with queer studies. There's a time in the 2000s it got very into the idea of choice and control as being central to representations of queer existence and expression in literature. I mean, there's a whole world of queer studies out there. But at base, understanding this story not just as effing with gender per se, or opening up, thinking about metaphors about the construction of race, or understandings of animals, non-human animals in animal society, but also as a depiction of queer desire. So those are all things that this story does, and that I'd invite you to think about as you read it or reread it, and then I'd like us then to come back and talk about it on the call. So this is sort of me introducing you to those concepts to ponder. And I'll see you later this week.